The atmosphere in the bipartisan summit was already charged, but no one could have foreseen the explosion that was about to unfold. Stacey Abrams, the Democratic titan renowned for her voting rights advocacy, rose from the panel table, her eyes blazing with intensity. Across from her sat John Neely Kennedy, the Republican senator from Louisiana, whose calm exterior belied a sharp mind ready to upend the room's assumptions. The conference, meant to bridge divides between Democrats and Republicans on urgent economic issues like inflation and job growth, was teetering on the edge of chaos. As Kennedy delivered a pointed challenge to Abrams's vision, her face hardened and her voice cut through the room like a thunderclap. "Get out!" The command reverberated, stunning the crowd into silence. Phones whipped out, capturing every moment. What John Kennedy said next didn't just shock the room, it sent ripples across the nation, setting the stage for a defining moment in American politics. Before we dive into this electrifying clash, hit that like button. If you're hooked on real political drama, and subscribe to stay in the loop on stories the mainstream media might shy away from. This wasn't just a spat between two political heavyweights. It was a clash of visions that laid bare the challenges of uniting a divided nation. Kennedy's response, delivered with unshakable poise, was about to show what true leadership looks like in a fractured world. The summit was pitched as a rare opportunity for collaboration, a gathering where leaders from both parties could tackle the economic struggles weighing on Americans: skyrocketing costs, stagnant wages, and shrinking opportunities. The room buzzed with anticipation, packed with high-profile donors, policy experts, and journalists, all hoping for a glimpse of unity in a polarized age. Abrams took the stage first, her presence commanding, as she launched into a passionate defense of voting rights as the cornerstone of democracy. Her speech was vintage Abrams, eloquent, forceful, and laser-focused on voter suppression, gerrymandering, and the need to protect every citizen's voice. The Democratic side of the room erupted in applause, donors nodding in approval, while others scribbled notes, impressed by her ability to frame the fight for democracy as both moral and urgent. Her words carried the weight of her reputation, built on years of turning Georgia into a battleground for Democratic victories. Then came John Kennedy's turn. The senator from Louisiana stood slowly, his unassuming demeanor masking a keen ability to cut through political rhetoric. Known for his straightforward, no-nonsense style, Kennedy didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I respect the fight for voting rights." He began his southern drawl, lending a conversational tone to his words. "But let's be real about what's keeping folks up at night. It's not just whether they can cast a ballot, it's whether that ballot will lead to a better life." The room shifted, a ripple of unease passing through the crowd. Kennedy wasn't attacking Abrams outright, but his focus on economic priorities, jobs, affordable housing relief from crushing inflation, felt like a direct challenge to her narrative. He spoke of small business owners in Louisiana struggling to stay afloat, of families stretched thin by rising costs, and of young people who felt politics had little to offer them. Democracy's foundation is the vote, he said, but its purpose is to deliver results, jobs that pay, schools that teach, communities that thrive. The air grew heavy. Abrams, seated at the panel table, leaned forward, her expression tightening. Donors exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. Journalists, sensing a brewing story, began typing furiously. Kennedy pressed on, undeterred. "We're here to find solutions, not to rehash old battles. People don't want more speeches about ideals, they want action that makes their lives better. If we can't deliver that, we're just talking to ourselves." His words were plain, but powerful, striking a chord with those in the room who'd grown frustrated with partisan stalemates. Yet for Abrams, whose career was built on the very ideals Kennedy seemed to sideline, The remarks landed like a personal affront. Her hands gripped the table, her carefully cultivated composure showing cracks. The tension wasn't just about policy differences, it was a clash of world views. Abrams had spent decades building coalitions around the idea that democracy's survival hinged on protecting the vote. Her work had mobilized millions, flipped states, and earned her a near-legendary status among Democrats. Kennedy, by contrast, approached politics with a pragmatist's lens, prioritizing the tangible concerns of everyday Americans over ideological crusades. His style wasn't about inspiring with grand visions. It was about connecting with people's real struggles, a trait that had made him a formidable figure in Louisiana and beyond. As he wrapped up his remarks calling for both parties to focus on economic relief over symbolic fights, a murmur ran through the crowd. Younger attendees especially seemed to lean in, drawn to his call for practical solutions. But Abrams's supporters bristled, their loyalty to her vision unwavering. That's when Abrams stood. The room fell deathly quiet, the scrape of her chair echoing like a warning shot. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice low but trembling with barely restrained anger, "you're missing the point of this summit. This is about protecting the foundation of our democracy, not dismissing it for some populist talking points." Her words carried a sharp edge, and the crowd held its breath. Kennedy sat calmly, his hands folded, his face betraying no hint of surprise. Abrams continued, her tone growing more heated. "I've spent my life fighting for people who've been shut out of the system, building the infrastructure that makes their voices heard. And you think you can come in here and tell us we're focused on the wrong thing?" Her accusation hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her legacy. Some donors nodded in solidarity, but others looked uneasy, sensing the conversation veering into uncharted territory. Kennedy raised a hand, signaling his intent to respond, but Abrams wasn't finished. "This summit is about finding common ground. Yes, but it's also about respecting the work that's gotten us here. You don't get to undermine that with talk about groceries and gas." Her voice was sharp now, her composure fraying at the edges. The room was so still you could hear the faint buzz of phones as attendees began texting, sensing a moment that would soon dominate headlines. Then came the eruption that would define the summit. Abrams, her face flushed with frustration, pointed directly at Kennedy and shouted, "Get out! Just get out of here, right now!" The words exploded through the room, shocking everyone into silence. Phones were raised, capturing the outburst in real time. Donors froze their eyes wide with disbelief. Journalists scrambled to record every detail, their fingers flying across keyboards. Even the moderator, a veteran of countless political events, seemed momentarily stunned, unsure how to regain control. Kennedy, however, remained unmoved. He adjusted his glasses, took a slow sip of water, and leaned forward slightly, his expression one of quiet resolve. The room waited breathless for his response. When he spoke, his voice was steady, his southern cadence grounding his words in a way that commanded attention. "Ms. Abrams," he began, "I'm not here to tear down your work. I'm here because I believe we can do more for the people we serve. You talk about democracy, and I agree. It's critical. But democracy isn't just about the right to vote. It's about making sure that vote leads to a better life." His words were simple but resonant, cutting through the tension like a knife. He wasn't attacking Abrams. He was redirecting the conversation to the people both parties claimed to represent, a move that left the audience captivated. Kennedy continued, his tone unwavering. "In Louisiana, I hear from folks who are struggling to make ends meet. They're not worried about voter suppression. They're worried about feeding their families, paying their rent, keeping their businesses alive. If we don't address those concerns, we're failing them, no matter how many ballots we protect." His argument landed with force, resonating with younger attendees who nodded subtly, their faces reflecting agreement. Even some of Abrams's supporters seemed to pause, as if his words had tapped into a truth they hadn't fully considered. He wasn't dismissing the importance of voting rights. He was expanding the conversation, urging the room to see democracy as a tool for tangible change, not an end in itself. Abrams, still standing, looked ready to interrupt, but Kennedy pressed on his voice, calm but firm. This summit was supposed to be about working together. I came here ready to listen, ready to find solutions. But if we can't talk honestly about what's hurting people, we're not serving them, we're just protecting our own agendas. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, it felt like the entire summit had shifted, as if Kennedy had exposed a fault line in the bipartisan facade. Abrams sat down, her face a mix of anger and disbelief, her hands still gripping the table. The moderator, finally regaining his composure, suggested a brief pause, but the room was already alive with whispers, the energy crackling with the realization that something monumental had just occurred. As the session broke, the buzz of conversation filled the air. Donors huddled in small groups, dissecting the exchange. Journalists typed furiously, crafting headlines that would soon flood social media. Kennedy remained in his seat, speaking quietly, with a staffer, his demeanor as composed as ever. But the younger attendees were already gravitating toward him, some approaching to ask questions, others simply nodding in respect. They saw in Kennedy what many had been yearning for: a leader who could challenge the status quo without losing his cool, who could disagree without resorting to division. The stage was set for what would come next, a moment that would test not just Kennedy's resolve, but the very idea of what it means to lead in a divided nation. Abrams's outburst had cracked open a divide, but Kennedy's response had begun to build a bridge, one that could either unite or further fracture the room. The room was still reeling from Stacey Abrams's explosive outburst, but no one was prepared for how the clash would escalate. Abrams, her face flushed with fury, stood trembling at the panel table, her demand for John Neely Kennedy to get out still echoing through the stunned conference hall. The Republican senator from Louisiana, unfazed by the chaos, sat calmly across from her, his steady gaze a stark contrast to her unraveling composure. The bipartisan summit, meant to forge unity on economic issues like jobs and inflation, had become a battleground of ideals, with donors, activists, and media hanging on every word. When Kennedy finally spoke, his response wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a masterclass in leadership that left the room speechless and set social media ablaze. Before we unpack this pivotal moment, hit that like button if you're gripped by this political showdown, and subscribe to catch every twist of the drama the mainstream media might downplay. This wasn't just a heated exchange between two political giants. It was a defining moment that exposed the raw tensions between rhetoric and reality in American politics. John Kennedy's calm, principled stand was about to show the world what it means to lead with reason in the face of rage. The silence following Abrams's outburst was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of air conditioning and the soft clicks of phones recording the scene. Every eye was on Kennedy, waiting to see how he'd respond to being publicly ejected by one of the Democratic Party's most celebrated figures. Abrams, her hands clenched into fists, stared him down, her anger palpable. The donors, some of whom had bankrolled Abrams's initiatives, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while journalists leaned forward, pens poised, sensing a career-defining story unfolding. The moderator, a seasoned political operative, stammered, "Perhaps we could," but his words were drowned out by the weight of the moment. Kennedy, adjusting his glasses with deliberate calm, leaned into the microphone, his southern drawl cutting through the tension like a cool breeze. "Ms. Abrams, He began, his voice steady and measured. "I'm not here to disrespect your work or your passion. I'm here because I believe we owe the American people more than arguments over who's right. We owe them solutions." His words landed like a quiet thunderclap, shifting the room's energy. Kennedy didn't raise his voice or match Abrams's intensity. Instead, he spoke with a clarity that commanded attention. "You've fought hard for voting rights, and that's admirable," he continued. "But let's talk about the folks I meet every day in Louisiana, families who can't afford their groceries, small business owners drowning in taxes, young people who don't see a future worth voting for. They're not asking for more speeches about democracy, they're asking for a government that works for them." The crowd stirred, some nodding, subtly others exchanging glances. Kennedy's focus on economic struggles, rising costs, shrinking opportunities resonated with those who felt politics had become too detached from everyday realities. His approach wasn't about tearing down Abrams's legacy. It was about broadening the conversation to include the people both parties often overlooked. Abrams, still standing, seemed ready to interrupt, but Kennedy pressed on, his tone unwavering. "This summit was supposed to be about finding common ground. I came here in good faith, ready to listen and share ideas. But if we can't have an honest discussion about what's hurting people, about jobs, about prices, about hope, then we're not serving them. We're just serving our own egos." The room was transfixed. Younger attendees especially leaned forward, their faces lighting up with recognition. Kennedy's words weren't just a response to Abrams. They were a call to rethink how leaders engage with each other and with the public. He wasn't dismissing the importance of voting rights. He was challenging the room to see them as part of a larger picture, one where economic security and opportunity were just as critical to a functioning democracy. The moderator tried again to intervene, his voice shaky. "Senator Ms. Abrams, perhaps we could move to the next topic." But Abrams wasn't ready to let go. Her face a mask of frustration, she pointed at Kennedy again. "Senator, you're sidestepping the core issue," she said, her voice sharp, but less steady than before. "You talk about jobs and groceries like they're separate from the fight for democracy. Without the right to vote, none of those things matter. I've spent my life building the systems that let people have a voice, and you're acting like that's irrelevant." Her words carried the weight of her decades-long crusade, but they also betrayed a defensiveness that hadn't been there before. The room sensed it, a crack in the armor of a leader who'd long been seen as unshakable. Kennedy didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, his expression one of quiet resolve. "Ms. Abrams, I'm not saying your work doesn't matter. I'm saying it's not the whole story. Folks in my state don't just want a voice, they want a life they can be proud of. They want to know their vote will lead to policies that help them pay their bills, send their kids to school, build a future. If we can't deliver that, we're failing them no matter how many ballots we protect." His response was a masterstroke, redirecting the conversation without dismissing Abrams's contributions. He spoke directly to the audience, his words grounded in the struggles of everyday Americans, not the abstractions of political dogma. Several donors, even those aligned with Abrams, seemed to pause, as if Kennedy's perspective had given them something new to consider. The exchange grew more intense as Abrams doubled down. "You're trivializing the fight for democracy," she said, her voice rising again. "You think you can come in here with your folksy charm and make it sound like economic issues are all that matter. That's a cop-out, Senator. You're ignoring the systemic barriers that keep people from even reaching the ballot box." Her accusation was sharp, aimed at painting Kennedy as out of touch, but it misfired. Kennedy's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to her escalating frustration, making her appear more reactive than resolute. He tilted his head slightly as if considering her words, then responded with a disarming simplicity. "I'm not ignoring those barriers, Ms. Abrams. I'm saying we've got to fight them while also tackling the barriers keeping people from living with dignity. We can do both, protect the vote and deliver results. But we can't do either if we're shouting at each other instead of listening." The room erupted in a low hum of murmurs. Younger attendees, particularly those frustrated with partisan gridlock, nodded in agreement, while some of Abrams's supporters looked unsettled, as if her outburst had undermined her own argument. Kennedy's ability to stay composed under pressure was turning the tide, making him the focal point of the summit. He continued, his voice steady, but infused with a quiet urgency. "I've seen what happens when we talk past each other. In Louisiana, we've got folks who feel like Washington doesn't hear them. Not Democrats, not Republicans, just people trying to get by. If we want to reach them, we've got to stop fighting over who's more right and start working on what's actually wrong." His words were a direct appeal to the room's shared purpose, a reminder that the summit was about solutions, not showdowns. Abrams, sensing the shift in the room, tried to regain control. "Senator, I've built coalitions that have changed the game in states like mine," she said, her tone softer but still defensive. "You don't get to lecture me about what people need when I've been on the ground making sure their voices are heard." It was a valid point, rooted in her undeniable achievements, but it felt reactive, overshadowed by her earlier outburst. Kennedy nodded, acknowledging her work without conceding the argument. "I respect what you've built," he said, "but respect doesn't mean agreement. The folks I represent are telling me they need more than a voice, they need results. And I think we can work together to deliver that, if we're willing to listen." The moderator, desperate to restore order, jumped in. "Let's take a moment to—" But Kennedy held up a hand, not rudely, but firmly. "I'd like to finish, if I may," he said, his politeness disarming. "This isn't about me or Ms. Abrams. It's about the people we're here to serve. If we can't have a real conversation about their struggles, about jobs, about costs, about hope, then we're not doing our jobs. I'm here to have that conversation, and I hope we can all be part of it." His words were a call to unity, not just for the summit, but for a broader approach to politics. The room was silent, absorbing the weight of his message. Even Abrams' supporters seemed to soften, if only slightly, as Kennedy's sincerity cut through the tension. The exchange had transformed the summit. What had started as a discussion about economic policy had become a referendum on leadership itself. Kennedy's calm, reasoned approach stood in stark contrast to Abrams's emotional eruption, earning him quiet nods from across the room. Younger attendees in particular were drawn to his message, seeing in him a leader who could challenge without destroying, who could disagree without disrespecting. Donors, too, were taking note, their whispered conversations buzzing with speculation about Kennedy's influence. Journalists, meanwhile, were already drafting headlines, knowing this moment would dominate the news cycle. As the session paused, the room was alive with energy. Attendees huddled in small groups, dissecting the clash. Some praised Kennedy's composure, others debated Abrams's reaction, but all agreed that something significant had happened. Kennedy remained seated, chatting quietly with a colleague, his demeanor as steady as ever. Abrams, meanwhile, sat back down, her face a mix of frustration and exhaustion. The moderator called for a brief break, but the real conversation was just beginning on social media, in newsrooms, and in the minds of everyone who'd witnessed the exchange. Kennedy's response hadn't just diffused the moment. It had redefined it, setting the stage for a broader debate about what leadership means in a divided nation. The firestorm had been ignited, and John Kennedy, with his unflappable resolve, was at its center. The fallout from Stacey Abrams' fiery outburst was still electrifying the conference room, but no one could have anticipated the tidal wave it would unleash beyond those walls. Abrams, the Democratic luminary whose shout of "Get out" at John Neely Kennedy had stunned the bipartisan summit, stood at the panel table, her composure shattered. Across from her, the Republican senator from Louisiana remained a pillar of calm, his measured response still ringing in the ears of donors, activists, and media. The summit, intended to unite both parties on economic challenges like inflation and job creation, had instead become a flashpoint for a national reckoning. As Kennedy's words, delivered with unyielding poise, spread like wildfire online, they didn't just shift the room's dynamic. They sparked a movement that redefined how America viewed political leadership. Before we dive into the seismic aftermath, hit that like button. If you're hooked on this political drama, and subscribe to catch every angle the mainstream media might sidestep. This wasn't just a clash between two titans, it was a moment that exposed the fragility of partisan divides and elevated John Kennedy as a beacon of principled resolve. The video of Abrams' outburst and Kennedy's response hit social media before the summit's break even ended. Clips titled "Stacey Abrams yelled at John Kennedy, 'Get out!'" His reply left everyone speechless, racked up thousands of views per minute, trending across platforms within hours. The footage captured every detail: Abrams' pointed finger, her voice cracking with rage, and Kennedy's steady gaze, his southern drawl delivering a calm but devastating case for practical leadership. Comments flooded in, ranging from praise for Kennedy's composure to criticism of Abrams' loss of control. The hashtag Kennedy vs. Abrams became a lightning rod, with users from both sides of the political spectrum weighing in. Progressives defended Abrams' passion, arguing her outburst reflected her deep commitment to voting rights. But a growing chorus, especially among younger voters and independents, hailed Kennedy as a voice of reason, someone who could cut through partisan noise with clarity and grace. Inside the conference room, the air was still thick with tension as attendees returned from the break. Donors whispered in clusters, their conversations a mix of shock and calculation. One prominent tech financier known for backing bipartisan initiatives leaned toward a colleague and murmured, "Kennedy just turned this summit into his stage." Journalists, meanwhile, were in a frenzy, their phones buzzing with editors demanding real-time updates. The moderator, visibly rattled, tried to steer the discussion back to economic policy. But the room's focus remained on the clash. Kennedy sat quietly, his demeanor unchanged, fielding questions from a few younger attendees who approached him during the break. His responses were brief but warm, reinforcing his image as approachable yet resolute. Abrams, by contrast, seemed subdued, her earlier fire replaced by a strained silence as she sipped water and avoided eye contact. Outside the summit, the media machine kicked into high gear. Cable news networks looped the viral clip with pundits dissecting every frame. CNN framed the incident as a clash of priorities, with one analyst noting Kennedy's focus on economic issues resonates with voters feeling the pinch. But Abrams's point about democracy's foundation isn't wrong. It's just not the whole picture. MSNBC leaned toward Abrams, with a commentator defending her as a warrior for justice under attack, though even they acknowledged Kennedy's remarkable restraint. Fox News predictably used the moment to highlight Democratic disarray, but even their hosts admitted Kennedy's response was sharp without being vicious. Political podcasts jumped in, with one popular show dedicating an episode to the Kennedy moment, praising his ability to redirect the conversation without personal attacks. Social media amplified the divide. Progressive accounts accused Kennedy of downplaying systemic issues, while others, including some surprising conservative voices, lauded his call for practical solutions over ideological battles. The donor community, a critical force in political circles, was quietly reassessing. Several who'd supported Abrams's voting rights initiatives began privately questioning her temperament. One major philanthropist, speaking anonymously to a political outlet, said, "I've always admired Stacey's work, but losing it like that in front of everyone, it makes you wonder if she's ready for the next step." Another donor, a hedge fund manager, was overheard praising Kennedy's cool-headedness, noting that his approach could appeal to swing voters tired of partisan shouting matches. These whispers signaled a shift. Kennedy's performance wasn't just winning the room, it was winning wallets, as some donors began exploring ways to engage with his platform of economic pragmatism. Kennedy himself seemed unfazed by the growing buzz. During a brief Q&A session after the break, he fielded questions about his economic vision, emphasizing policies like tax relief for small businesses and workforce training programs. His answers were direct, peppered with anecdotes about Louisiana workers, a factory hand struggling with rising costs, a single mother juggling 2 jobs. "These folks aren't asking for a lecture on democracy," he said, echoing his earlier remarks. "They're asking for a government that shows up for them." His focus on real-world issues, delivered with a folksy charm, drew nods from across the room, even from some Democratic attendees. One young staffer working for a progressive think tank later told a reporter, "I came here skeptical of Kennedy, but he's saying what a lot of us are thinking: we need to talk about people's actual lives." Abrams, meanwhile, attempted damage control. During the same Q&A, she returned to her core message, doubling down on the importance of voting rights. "Without a voice, none of these economic issues can be addressed," she said, her tone more measured, but still tinged with defensiveness. She avoided mentioning Kennedy directly, focusing instead on her record of mobilizing voters and flipping states. But the room's energy had shifted. Her words, once a guaranteed applause line, felt flat compared to Kennedy's grounded appeal. A few of her supporters clapped, but others seemed distracted, their attention drawn to their phones, where the viral clip was gaining traction. One activist whispered to a colleague, "She's not wrong, but she's not winning this moment." The broader political world began grappling with the implications. Political analysts saw the clash as a microcosm of deeper tensions, not just between Democrats and Republicans, but within the very idea of political leadership. A prominent political scientist tweeted, "Kennedy's response shows what happens when you prioritize substance over spectacle." Abrams's outburst, while human, risks alienating those who want dialogue, not drama. Another analyst writing for a major outlet argued, "This isn't about who's right or wrong, it's about who can lead in a way that brings people together." Kennedy's doing that right now. The generational divide was also evident. Younger voters, active on social media, gravitated toward Kennedy's call for practical solutions, while older activists rallied around Abrams's defense of democratic principles. The summit's organizers, caught off guard by the escalation, scrambled to maintain control. A press release issued that afternoon emphasized the event's goal of constructive dialogue, but it did little to quell the storm. Kennedy's team, meanwhile, stayed quiet, letting his performance speak for itself. Sources close to him later revealed he'd anticipated pushback, but hadn't expected Abrams's eruption. He saw it as an opportunity, one aide said, to show what real leadership looks like, not shouting, but reasoning. Abrams's team, by contrast, was in crisis mode, with advisors urging her to issue a statement addressing the outburst. She resisted initially, believing it would give the incident more oxygen, but the relentless social media buzz forced her hand. By the end of the day, the narrative was clear. Kennedy had emerged as the victor, not through aggression, but through composure and clarity. His ability to redirect the conversation from personal conflict to shared purpose resonated with a public weary of partisan bickering. Posts on social media began calling him the adult in the room, a moniker that stuck as the clip continued to circulate. One viral tweet summed it up. Kennedy didn't just win the argument, he showed us how to disagree without destroying each other. The summit, meant to be a footnote in the political calendar, had become a turning point with Kennedy. At its heart, his words sparking a conversation that would echo far beyond the conference walls. As the day drew to a close, attendees left the summit buzzing with excitement and uncertainty. Kennedy, still composed, shook hands with a few lingering attendees, his demeanor as steady as ever. Abrams, visibly drained, left quickly, flanked by aides. The media donors and activists were already looking ahead, wondering how this moment would shape the political landscape. Would Kennedy leverage his newfound prominence to push for bipartisan solutions? Would Abrams recover from the public misstep? One thing was certain: the ripple effect of this clash was just beginning, and John Kennedy's calm, principled stand had set a new standard for what leadership could be. The echoes of Stacey Abrams's fiery "Get Out" still hung in the air, but the real impact of the clash with John Neely Kennedy was only beginning to unfold. Abrams, the Democratic icon whose outburst had rocked the bipartisan summit, stood exposed, her moment of rage now a viral symbol of division. Across from her, Kennedy, the Louisiana senator, had turned the confrontation into a defining moment, his calm resolve reverberating far beyond the conference room. The summit, meant to unite leaders on economic challenges like jobs and inflation, had instead become a crucible for a new kind of leadership, one Kennedy embodied with unshakable clarity. As the nation dissected the fallout, his response didn't just reshape the narrative, it offered a roadmap for bridging divides. Before we unpack the profound lessons of this moment, hit that like button. If you're inspired by real leadership, and subscribe to catch every story the mainstream media might overlook. This wasn't just a political spat. It was a turning point that challenged America to rethink how we engage across differences, with Kennedy's principled stand lighting the way. The viral clip of the confrontation had taken on a life of its own, shared millions of times, and dissected on every major news outlet. Commentators across the spectrum marveled at Kennedy's ability to stay composed, while Abrams unraveled, framing it as a lesson in leadership under pressure. Political analysts began calling it the Kennedy Standard, a term that captured his approach: reasoned, respectful, and relentlessly focused on the needs of everyday people. Social media buzzed with praise, particularly from younger voters and independents, who saw in Kennedy a rare figure, one who could disagree without demonizing, challenge without destroying. One widely shared post read, "Kennedy didn't just win the moment. He showed us how to talk to each other again." The sentiment struck a chord, reflecting a public hunger for leaders who could rise above partisan noise. In the days following the summit, Kennedy's influence grew. Invitations poured in from bipartisan groups, think tanks, and even progressive organizations eager to hear his perspective on bridging divides. He accepted several speaking at events, where he reiterated his core message: politics isn't about who shouts loudest. It's about who delivers for the folks back home. His focus on economic issues, job training, tax relief, cost of living solutions, gained traction, resonating with Americans tired of ideological battles. Donors, too, took notice. Some who'd previously backed Abrams began redirecting support to initiatives aligned with Kennedy's pragmatic vision, with one prominent philanthropist publicly praising his ability to listen and lead at the same time. The shift wasn't just financial. It was cultural, signaling a growing appetite for leaders who prioritized results over rhetoric. Abrams, meanwhile, struggled to regain her footing. Her team issued a carefully worded apology, acknowledging her passionate reaction, while reaffirming her commitment to voting rights. But the statement felt hollow, overshadowed by the viral image of her pointing at Kennedy, her voice cracking with anger. In interviews, she leaned on her record, citing her role in mobilizing voters and flipping states. But the narrative had shifted. The public, especially younger audiences, saw her outburst as a refusal to engage with valid criticism, a stark contrast to Kennedy's openness. One political commentator noted Abrams's legacy is undeniable, but this moment showed she's not infallible. Kennedy, on the other hand, turned a crisis into a conversation. The broader impact was a national dialogue about leadership itself. Op-eds and podcasts debated what the clash revealed about America's political divide. A leading political scientist wrote Kennedy's response reminds us that leadership isn't about silencing dissent, it's about embracing it to find common ground. The lesson was clear true. Leaders don't just defend their positions, they listen, adapt, and build bridges. Kennedy's approach became a case study in political science classes, with professors using the summit footage to teach students about effective communication in high-stakes settings. One student tweeted, "Kennedy showed me you can disagree and still respect someone. That's what I want in a leader." Kennedy's stand at the summit became a blueprint for resolving conflict in any setting, emphasizing shared goals like economic opportunity and the belief that progress comes from dialogue, not division. His message, "We're not here to tear each other down. We're here to lift each other up, together," inspired Kennedy conversations, community forums that spread across states and led to the bipartisan Common Ground Solutions Initiative, training local leaders to foster dialogue. Backed by diverse supporters, Kennedy's calm, principled approach turned division into unity, challenging Americans to value listening over shouting and making his call to agree to talk a rallying cry for healing the nation's divides.